What's up, Vybez fam? This is Peta.1 here with another Vybez episode of our Vybez Shortz Conversation series. I am so very excited to have my lovely guest, Miss Silvy Khoucasian. Is that how I pronounce that? Does that sound
Khoucasian. Close enough.
Khoucasian?
Khoucasian.
Khoucasian. Okay, I was worried I mispronounced that, but that's okay. That's why you're here to correct me. Yes, Miss Silvy Khoucasian. And I'm so excited to have you here, Silvy. I've been such a big fan of your work for a long time, and all of the work that you post on your social media around relationships and attachment styles and boundaries and all the things. And I'm excited to have this conversation with you today about boundaries. So welcome to the program. Welcome to Vybez. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm so honored when you reached out to me because we met at an event and
Yes.
I was like, yes, you're just our energy is just like bloop. It was very special meeting you, and I'm honored everything that you said. And a little bit about me, I'm a relationship coach. I really specialize in the domain of creating healthy relationship habits that are mutually supportive and nourishing. And I also work as an associate psychotherapist under a supervisor right now, working towards my licensure, and all really focused primarily within the relationship realm. Um, and yeah, I love to work on boundaries, attachment theory, attachment styles, and really helping people unpack, helping them to understand themselves and how some of their earlier childhood experiences can become mirrored in their adult relationships and how
Mm,
they can create more supportive relationships all across the board.
yes. Yes. I feel like your work is definitely so important and so important in these times, especially. And with the topic of boundaries, with the lockdown and people having to be in more intimate spaces with each other and stay home and with their kids home and not having to be in school and virtual school and all of those things. I feel like boundaries, I heard a lot of it last year. I was like, boundaries, we got to set boundaries. We got to learn how to set boundaries. You have to know what boundaries are and learn how to incorporate more of that because um, it promotes more of a healthy lifestyle and well-being, I feel. And I feel like it's so important to talk about it because I myself was having difficulties with understanding boundaries and how to incorporate more boundaries into my life and understanding it for myself. Like, do I set boundaries for myself? Like, first, like, how does that all work? So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today and to dive right in. So actually, before we do, I do want to talk a little bit about you. Like, how did you get to, yeah, like I love people and their stories, and I'd love to know your journey and how you got here to becoming a relationship coach and also to getting your license as a licensed therapist.
I'm like, where? It's always like, I never know what to share. My brain, whenever I get that question, it's like 20 different stories come up. So I'm like, all right, so there's no right story. They're
Yeah.
all stories, right?
Well, what called you towards the coaching lifestyle? We can
Well,
start there.
I think so much of, the stories we hear are we pursue fields that either we struggled with or we saw people close to us struggle with. So for
Mhm.
me, being in relationships was intimate relationships in particular, was challenging in the sense that it was really hard for me to express what was going on for me without blaming, projecting, um, focusing externally. And even though I was still in relationships that lasted long periods of time, there was often that vulnerability piece was missing. I didn't know what vulnerability was or how do you be, you said, how do you do boundaries? I was like, how do you do vulnerability? What do you share? So it
Right.
was all very confusing for me. And I think relational education is so vital and it's so missing from so many of our lives unless we grow up in an environment where um, that's just a normalized experience, that's brought into the home or it's weaved in within the culture. And I think a lot of that was not present. And I immigrated with my family when I was 4 years old to the US from Syria and Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
And we were in survival mode. We were in survival mode. My parents were working their butts off to keep food on the table, to make sure that we were taken care of. And I was a particularly really sensitive child, had anxiety. And I realized as I got older, there were certain things that I needed to tend to. And going to therapy, doing workshops, and things where relational education and emotional intelligence was really prioritized. I thrived in those environments. And I remember really struggling in school with the math and the science. It was like, I'm terrible at these things. But when
Too.
it would come to psychology and English and, things that were more mental health related, I thrived, and it came very naturally to me. And so I started to pursue it and just kind of follow that path and just fell in love with it. And being able to support other people with the tools that I've learned. And again, this doesn't mean that I don't blame, that I don't project. I
Yeah.
still do those things. My
Yeah.
partner will tell you I still do those things.
Yeah.
But I can catch myself, and I know what's going on. I know to go internally and see, okay, what was going on for me? How do I work with this in a way that's more relationally sensitive, and also honor my own experience? What's happening inside of me? What's the vulnerability piece there, so that I can connect with myself, and then really starting to support others with that same journey.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. Do you feel like at this point in time, like choosing that path and that journey for you, like, do you feel like you have, um, like, I know you said you've said you're not like exactly perfect at it, but I don't think that even that's even the goal, to be perfect at it, but to know that you can, and it's a tool and you can have it. It's in your back pocket, and how to show up vulnerably. But like I feel like I want to ask, like, what was that point in time where you were just like, what you getting feedback from your partners that you're not able to show vulnerably? Like, what was that whole space for you in realizing, like, hey, maybe I'm not very good at being vulnerable. Like, what triggered that for you in your relationships?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. You know, it wasn't the feedback. I almost wish I got more feedback. I wish I
Mhm.
got someone to like mirror me. Hey, what's going on for you? You keep blaming me. What's going on for you? And it
Yeah.
was my therapist that actually did that when I
Mhm.
would come into sessions and be like, well, my partner's doing X, Y, and Z and LQPW and all these things. And she's like, well, I hear you on all of those things. What's going on for you in all of that? And I was just remember sitting there like my jaw like wanted to drop to the floor. And I was like, oh yeah, what is going on for me? So it
Yeah.
was her doing that over and over and over again. And I was very much a runner in my relationships. I have
Mhm.
high when I'm in a relationship intimately, romantically,
Mhm.
even with some friends when it gets really, really intimate,
Yeah.
uh, that relationship anxiety kicks in high gear for me.
Mm.
So I would be the person that threatened to break up with my partner in like my 8 year relationship, on and off, on and off. And I was like,
Mm.
I didn't realize I was doing that. It became like this really unhealthy dynamic that it would just play out. Every time I would have an experience, I didn't know how to express it. It would remain unresolved. And then
Mm.
I would want to, and again, at that point, I wanted to do work. I didn't have access. We didn't know, it wasn't culturally normalized. So I think what happened with my current relationship with Brian, which is I'm 30, I'm 36 now. And with him, again, the patterns started to play out over and over again. And I realized, wow, it's happening everywhere. There's
Mm.
something here. I'm like, again, it's that common denominator piece. There's, of course, does my partner have stuff they bring? Do other partners have stuff they bring? Yes, but I'm just talking about my side of the equation in this. And I realized that a big missing link for me was that inability to sit with and tolerate my difficult feelings, particularly shame. Shame
Mm.
was huge. Every
Yeah.
time I would bring up something of whether it was a need or a boundary, or I felt like a monster in a way, I couldn't present it well. And yeah, shame would come up, and then I would make it about the other person, deflect, and then potentially try to leave the relationship.
Mm.
So that was a really nasty pattern that I had to wake up to. That was a what does it call, a dark night of the soul over a long
Yeah.
period of
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And it still comes up, when that fear to run in the relationship kicks in. It still
Mhm.
does. up from time to time, it's like I know what it is, and I know what it's bringing up to my attention, that there's some pretty heavy feelings that want to be looked at and sat with, and it's hard.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, but what a revelation though. I feel like that's so important to really see our patterns. And I think it's hard, it's really hard for people to see that, you know, like when I started doing my own self development work and seeing my patterns, like there was a lot of shame. I was like, I'm doing that, especially around attachment styles. I was like, I am
Mm.
anxious attachment style, and that's a hot mess, you know, like so I was going in.
You know, like how did it look like for you when it would come up?
I think that when I discovered that I was operating from an anxious attachment style in a relationship that I was in, I feel like I just felt like I was like, that's not me. I felt like I've been operating in this space for so long, but it felt like a fake version of me. I was like, but that's just to see it. I was like, wait.
Mm.
And I got like, it was a whole ego death around it. I was like, no, I cried. I had a whole breakdown. I was just like, I couldn't believe I was operating like that because there was some shame in it too. But I was like, I didn't know any better. I've been doing that for 30 something years and I didn't know. So when it came up for me, I was like, but I was so grateful. I was like, yes, because it changed so much within me. I was like, well who am I really? Because I was like, that's not me. So then who am I? You know, who am I really? And how do I really want to show up? And how do I really want to feel in my relationships? And oh, it was major. It was major. And I'm grateful for it because I see myself in a whole different way. And I see now it helped me to see my own patterns in these relationships, in all of my relationships, really, but mostly in intimate relationships. You know, that type of style was showing up. And so, yeah. So for me,
So hard to see those parts of ourselves.
oh my
It's so
God.
hard to hold it and not want to run away from it.
Yeah, I just heard about it. I had been reading about, you know, attachment styles and information that you provided, and I actually first heard about it from your work. And but I'd read about it logically, like I got it, but I was in a personal development program when it was explained, like broken down, and I was like, oh shit, that's me. Like I can't believe that. Like that's not no. Like I was in denial. It was a whole grievance. Like I was in denial. Like that's not me. I can't believe that. How could I show up that way? But I got to be because I'm generally like hard on myself, so I had to come back and be like, but you didn't know any better, Peta. Like it's okay. And yeah, so that's why too I feel it's important to have these conversations because most of us really don't are unless you're very keen and aware of like how you show up in the world, most of us are kind of like just operating from the whole subconscious level and not really realizing our patterns and our behaviors. So yeah, so I love that though. I love these conversations where we get to just uncover and dive deep into, right, like take all of that shit off and dive deep into what's here now for us and how we get to show up in the world. So
Normalizing it, right? So people
yeah.
that are in relationships don't feel like they have to be perfect, that these things happen, that when we're in intimate relationships, this stuff that's deeply within us gets excavated,
Mm,
and a lot of us are left like not knowing what do we do now, and we might want to, whether it's run away or just feel like you said really bad about ourselves. And that's also one of the reasons why, you know, my work has evolved within the attachment framework. I really try hard not to use the labels, because again, that's like we can identify with it almost too much. I
mm,
try really
mhm.
hard to say, you know, whenever we're working with attachment theory, to really look at the behaviors and the tendencies that are both, you know, that are gifts that come with each style, but also what are the behaviors and patterns that might benefit from being looked at and being worked on, and finding counter ways to approach those same needs that exist within them. Because I do find that it's like we can become really identified with certain things and almost miss other contexts
Yeah,
that can be creating things, like being in a relationship with a really, but with a person that is unavailable or not
yeah,
present, speaking harmfully to us, and then we make it all about our own attachment style stuff when it's not really the whole picture,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I get that completely. Yeah, there's so much to it. There's so much to it. But I think like it just kind of buckles down to what feels good to you
Absolutely.
within your awareness, you know?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I had to figure it out for myself, but it was a really, really very like enlightening journey for me and humbling too. It was like, whoa, okay, that's not us. All right. So
It's like the same way that somebody, one person might say, I really love having a diagnosis of anxiety because, like, now I know what it is. I can work with it.
mhm,
And then there's some people that are like, I don't want to say that I have anxiety, but I can acknowledge that I have anxious behaviors. So
right.
I really appreciate you saying that because there is no, everyone is the, what's the word I'm looking for? They're the only ones that know what works for them. And
Yeah.
that label, those labels and frameworks, um, they're different. They're expressed differently for each of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even so, to speak to that, I feel like now that I know, like, I see those patterns coming up for me and I can like change them. I'm like, no, that's not a healthy way to express that or to share that or to, and I feel like it's very attached to boundaries as well. I would love to, if this feels good to you, to have a whole different conversation around attachment styles. I think that's, man,
No, we're
attachment.
going down the rabbit hole, Peter.
I know it's like attachment styles are like we got like it's a whole different show, but
I'll
um
go wherever you want to take me right now.
yes, I mean it's so hard to just not go there, but for the sake of time and what we showed up for, which is talk about boundaries, I'm gonna stick to that. But yeah, it's so much. But yeah, so for boundaries, right? Could you describe what boundaries mean for you? Like,
For me.
because for you, yes. Yeah. We could do the general boundaries term, yes, but I feel like I'd love to know like your definition of boundaries
Hmm.
to set us up.
So the simplest way that I can describe boundaries would be that they're limits. Boundaries are limits that protect our integrity and our well-being.
Mm,
That's like the most simplified. And then if we expand beyond that definition, that would include our spiritual well-being, our mental and intellectual well-being, our emotional well-being, um, our physical well-being, and some people will also include their energetic well-being for people that are more energetically attuned. And boundaries are, they're very personal,
mm,
meaning like I have my own boundaries around things like my how much alone time I need, how much connection time I can tolerate. And then there are boundaries that are very relational, meaning like a boundary with a particular person will look a certain way, and then with another person it might look different based on the type of relating that we're having. And they're also very contextual,
mm,
and meaning the level of comfort and safety I feel to express and to share my boundaries is greatly impacted by, again, if there's power dynamics in the room,
mm,
someone feel very unsafe to potentially express them, if there's a potential consequence for sharing it. And they're also very cultural. I remember,
mm.
this is one of the most fascinating examples I can give you of a boundary experience that I had. I was at a party. It was like 2 year parties. I miss parties,
I
Peta.
know. Oh my god.
What's a party, right?
Party for one. Right.
Party for what?
Yeah.
So I was at a party, and it was again, it was a party. And I just remember standing there with my partner, and someone approached me, someone that I had never met before. And I was standing near the wall, and this person came up towards me, and she came really close to me.
Okay.
I remember my visceral reaction, my body just like leaped back.
Oh,
Like my leg like went up to hit like the floor. She probably didn't really notice it very much because, again, it
yeah.
was more of a loud environment. But I remember that's like an example of like an energetic physical boundary moment that I had.
Mm,
That was, again, that can be very culturally specific. In some parts of the world, standing close is very normal, and there's a tolerance for that that's just become very normalized in a culture. And there's some cultures where there's more honoring of that space. I think here in the West we would probably identify with that, in America. um, so there's so many different
Mhm.
frameworks and lenses that we really want to be mindful of and sensitive when we're talking about boundaries. And the reason I bring those layers up really quickly is because it's very easy to assume that boundaries will exist across the spectrum in the same way for everyone, and they really don't.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's why it can be so complex, because it's definitely like personal for each individual. Um, but for you, I'm just curious about everything. But for you, that boundary, when that person, was it more so like physical, or was it cultural? Was it like, you said it was like energetic, but like did you not feel good, or you were just like, no, that's
I felt
yeah,
invaded, and that's
okay.
one of the things that we can pay attention to, like our physical space. So the framework that I really like to use, and me and you talked about this a little bit, is from the work of Rokelle Lerner, and
Mhm.
she identifies four different types of boundaries. And this is, I love this tool, I love this map, because it helps to define boundaries for those of us that, again, this is maybe new for us. We have no idea what boundaries were, what's appropriate, what is it, just we don't have the language to even articulate what's going on in the boundary,
Right.
right? I know I related to that. I was like, how do you know what's when something's violated?
Yeah.
And so she talks about spiritual boundaries, physical boundaries, emotional and intellectual. The example I gave would be, for me, what I would consider a physical boundary. Someone might
Mm,
use an energetic. That doesn't resonate for me, but someone
right.
might. So as soon as I felt like, oh, I feel like this person is coming too close into my space, my immediate reaction was to back away. Maybe in the past I would have stood there, because I used to go more into freeze mode myself, into
Mm,
freeze, because of power dynamic stuff I've experienced in my past.
yeah.
When I started to do more boundary work, I've allowed myself to really um, slowly, again, this is a practice, putting those boundaries in practice, even if it might make the other person feel a little uncomfortable. I can
Mhm.
deal with the discomfort of the other person when I take care of myself first. I can't do that if I'm uncomfortable myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Ooh, that hit. Like, I love that. Yeah, you can't set boundaries and limitations for yourself if you don't take care of yourself first.
You can't.
Sylvie, Sylvie. Whew. I felt that one. I felt that one. Because I feel like that's also to like where people go with boundaries. Like for me in the beginning, right? I was like, and I think this is a good segue into boundaries versus barriers, right? So for me, I've been the type of person before I was even more educated on boundaries. I was like, well, if I feel a certain way, then I cut it off. I'm just like, nope,
Mm.
you stay all the way over there, and I'm gonna mind my business over here. And I don't want to see or speak or talk to you. Like that's how I feel when people like violate my boundaries, and not really knowing that I just know I don't feel good. I was like, something don't feel right. Something you said don't feel right to me. Something that you did don't feel right to me, and I don't want anything to do with you. So I feel like if I understood back then, like I do now, the purpose of boundaries, which is to, like you said, take care of your own self and your own well being, like putting limits and boundaries on, I don't know, people or situations or things that don't feel good to you.
Rigidity of boundaries, how in the past you've been more so kind of like, it feels like maybe more of a shutting out experience for you.
Right. Then, like, a healthy way of just communicating that what does and does not feel good to me. So I feel like a lot of people get lost in that, in the whole, I'm gonna set boundaries, but they're really setting walls, and they're not very aware of how the like just the thought process of how the boundary would affect the other person, how the boundary affects you, and how it plays out in the relationship. So, or the relation, or the thing, or the situation, or whatever. So I'd love to go down that rabbit hole with you, which is boundaries versus barriers. I feel like a lot of people get confused and they put up barriers instead of healthy boundaries. So I'd love for you to dive into that, please.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about a wall is typically more of a defense. It's more of a protective mechanism that really keeps us, again, it's in service of self-protection in the
Mhm.
same way that a boundary might be. But and again, I really want to visualize, like whenever I talk about this conversation, I like to visualize like a ball, and like on the outskirts of that circle of that ball, there are people that are not really, they're not close to us, like that woman at the party. Like I'm not going to probably get into a conversation with her about why I
Right.
backed away. She probably didn't even notice, but had she,
Yeah.
I doubt she would have approached me and said, "Well, why did you do that? We don't have a relationship, right? I'm going to
Right.
take care of myself in a kind way,
Hmm.
just take care of myself and move away." As people get closer and closer to our circle is when we want to be mindful if walls are present. And walls can sometimes be present. I like the example you gave because I think that's a distinction that I've never even really thought about until you said it, is that sometimes we set walls because we don't know how to express the boundary or the needs underneath it. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's going on, but I know I feel bad. So I need to just put up this wall to take care of myself.
Yeah.
Had I maybe known what was going on for me or expressed the boundary in a way to the person, they would have responded well, we would have been good. Maybe I could have relaxed that wall.
Hmm.
So sometimes we go through phases in our lives where walls are necessary.
Yeah.
I remember going through a very cult-like experience with my partner. We worked with a coach that was very intrusive with boundaries.
Mm.
I was traumatized for months afterwards. I had walls up. They weren't boundaries. I couldn't go to social events. I would go sit in the car when my partner would go up to the events, and I was okay with that because I needed to kind of wall myself out off temporarily to create my safety very, very slowly. And you can also say those were really protective, strong walls.
Yeah.
When we want to be mindful of wall is that when we're in relationship with someone that we are somewhat close to, that we trust, that is very respectful, that is really responsive with boundaries, that wants to respect what we need, and we're still noticing that there's no feeling of intimacy or vulnerability happening, that's usually a potential wall that might be present. It's
Mm.
important to look at because if we're not able to assess why we are creating that rigidity, it really prevents us from having a deep relationship with people.
Mm. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That made more sense than it ever did. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think like what you said that really stood out to me was that just fine tuning the your reasons for wanting to have that boundary, which is you said vulnerability and intimacy. And I was
Yes.
like, ooh, that's a difference, right? That's a whole difference in like how you would distinguish in what kind of like boundaries you want to put up with what kind of relationship that you have with the other person or thing or situation. Yeah, I love that because I feel now I can do it. Now I can distinguish that. But I like that you put it like there needs to be, not needs to, but if there is a certain amount of vulnerability and intimacy um, offered within that connection, then that seems to make more sense to what kind of boundary you want to put up, whether it's a wall, you need to distance yourself completely, or like, I love you, but this needs to be a limit for me or a boundary. So,
And walls don't show up out of nowhere. They're usually in response to something, whether it's a traumatic experience or being in situations where our boundaries were violated, like
mm,
over and over and over again. So it becomes like a protective way to not get hurt again or to not have to deal with those painful feelings and memories that can come up as we start to relax the wall, relax those more rigid boundaries.
mm.
Maybe it would be helpful for me to share a little bit about those four distinguishing.
Yeah, yeah, I did want to get into that with you. The yeah, the Raquel Lerner, is that's her name? Raquel
Yes.
Lerner. Yes. Please break them down. I'd love
Break
to.
them down.
Yeah.
And the reason I really love this map of, there's more than these four. There's material boundaries. There's, we can dive deeper within the physical boundaries and go within sexual boundaries. But I like
Mhm.
more because I think they're a very good basic entry point to boundaries.
Yeah.
And sometimes understanding how you can be violated can help you start to develop your own.
Yeah.
So, for example, physical boundaries. This is the most easy for people to understand. It's that space, how I do and don't like to be touched. If someone touches me inappropriately, this is where obviously the line from, physical abuse, sexual abuse, that's where it can go and be very, very violating. Some
Mhm.
people don't want to be touched a certain way, or they can't tolerate a certain kind of hugging for too long. Their level of intolerance for intimacy is that's like for us to determine and decide as we evolve. Um, Children that have been not necessarily violated, but even just like forced to hug when they didn't want to, or a family
Mhm.
member can feel like there are those red flag signals that really tell you whether we're open or closed start to not work as well when
Yeah.
we're having to do these things repeatedly that go against our physical boundaries. So what happens is as adults it becomes harder to notice those things.
Mm.
So we just want to, we want to take some inventory. Was my physical space honored as a kid? And if it wasn't, what are some ways that I can be more sensitive to resensitizing this for myself? Because that's a lot of
Mhm.
it, right? Whether that's through
Yeah.
yoga, maybe a healing massage place with someone that you feel safe with to help you reconnect with your body. Then there's the emotional boundaries, and those can be injured or violated when we grow up in a with a caregiver that, for example, um, maybe they shared things with us that were really inappropriate, or
Mm.
they invalidated our feelings, or a parent's divorced and I became the surrogate partner to my one of my parents. Like, they really used me for a lot of that emotional comfort when I'm the child and I need to experience that
Mhm.
comfort.
Mhm.
And so that can also, it can be the boundaries that were often injured and violated for us as kids can be the hardest to detect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hard because again, we're so familiar with it happening that
Mm.
we really want to start to bring our intellect, like, logically, did this person invalidate my feelings back there? Like taking some time after spending time with people or after dates and just kind of like a journalist, just exploring the logics of what happened.
Yeah.
And then there's intellectual boundaries. If you grow up in an environment that you weren't allowed to have your own opinion, everyone had to have the same the same politic views, or parents got divorced, nobody talked about it, or there was a parent that struggled with mental health or drinking, and again, nobody talked about it. So this child is left really processing, like, wait, why is everyone acting like everything's fine? Everything's not fine.
Yeah.
It can start to get really confusing. Or this happens on social media a lot. Things get misunderstood, and we make all kinds of projections about what people mean.
Yeah.
Those are, in a way, boundary violations. Like, we're
Mm.
making all kinds of assumptions about people without really we're not making space for other people to have their own experience. And again, we can go down the rabbit hole of this because there's some people that are, standing against oppressions and systemic things that sometimes need to be called out, and that's which is not okay.
Yeah.
And then the last piece is a spiritual one, which is the most challenging. Growing up in a spiritual home where, let's say, you were really upset and you were hurt about something, and a parent wants you to read scripture. They're not really able to be with your real life experience. In a
Mm.
way, it's like bypassing towards that spirituality, which is beautiful when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Never seeing a parent be vulnerable and never really seeing their human side.
Yeah.
And of course, if we take it more, as adults, cults, spiritual cults. And those are some of the most traumatic boundary violations that can happen and can be so um, challenging to recover from. And that's why I really wanted to say walls sometimes serve a purpose.
Yeah.
They're there until we're like, okay, it's been, 3 months, it's been 6 months, I'm really lonely. Maybe it's time for me to get professional support in a safe container so I can start looking at this, so I can start exploring why I can't feel connected to people anymore.
Mm.
A lot. But was that
Yeah.
clear?
Yeah. Yeah. No, you broke those down. I was going to ask you about all four. So I'm glad you broke that down. I do have a question about a few of those boundaries because as you were explaining it, like these questions came up. But for physical boundaries, right, you were saying that And I never thought of that about it, but because some people who have physical boundaries, you just assume like that's their boundaries and they just don't like being touched. But you also added that like people can desensitize themselves to um, touch, and they can like go to them. And I never thought about it in that way. I'm just like, okay, you have a boundary, you don't want to be touched. Like that's that. Um, because I'm a, like a touchy feely person. Like I like to, but I'm very aware. Like if I touch you, I pay attention to how you're feeling about it, because I just like to touch people. I like to feel connected to people in that way. And I do physical therapy for a living, so that's just naturally like what I like.
And
Um,
physical touch is one of the most regulating and connecting experiences for humans, even more so than speaking sometimes.
exactly. So, and then I find myself like if I hug somebody or touch somebody and they kind of pull away, like I get offended. I'm like, what? You don't want me to touch you? Okay. Like, you know what I mean? Like not to and to not take it personal, because that's their boundary. And that's also too another element to boundaries that I do want to talk to you about, because I feel like there's also people that don't receive boundaries very well, right? Like you feel like, okay, it's you, there's something wrong with me, like because they're setting this boundary with me, and I'm not too, I don't feel good about it. And so but before we go there, I love the desensitizing part to physical boundaries. So I was like, oh, it's cool. um for emotional boundaries, what is a good example of emotional boundaries? Like I was trying to understand that as you were expressing it. But would it just be a need that
As
is
an
not being
adult,
met
do you mean like as an adult, Peta?
as an adult? Yes.
Sure. This is one that I've particularly struggled with, so I'm happy to give you an example.
Please.
So if I'm sharing a feeling in my relationship, my partner is very comfortable with me sharing this. I have his permission. I honor his boundaries. I'm modeling that.
Yeah.
Um, in the beginning of our relationship, he's very intellectual. One of the things that was challenging for him was when I would be really upset, it would he would want to intellectualize my experience.
Mm.
What I needed was for my feelings just to be heard, to be validated, to be sat with. And so, and these are little micro things. You know, nobody's intentionally trying to violate our boundaries. These are injuries that happen relationally all the time.
Hmm.
They're so important to normalize it. And what we want to do, the reason why boundaries and expressing them is so important, and expressing the needs within them, is because those are the repair possibilities. So when I say to my partner, and this was really challenging because I didn't know a lot of times that was happening. Hey, you know, when I share my feelings, it really upsets me when you minimize them or when you try to intellectualize them. Can you please just stay with me? You know, just don't do that. You know, we have enough comfort with each other. Like, don't do that, honey. It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I did that. You know, and being open on the receiving end of that. Of course, sometimes we're going to feel rejected, right? Like, of course, sometimes we're going to feel like, shit, I did this bad thing. I made a mistake. And so, or another emotional boundary that shows up for me is someone venting a lot.
Mm.
Someone going through a process, let's say they're going through a breakup. This is a particular area that's sensitive for me. Again, this is boundaries are personal.
Yeah.
But if you have if you've had sensitivities around these things injured as children, it can be something that may require more boundaries as an adult because these are particular vulnerabilities you might have.
Yeah.
So if someone is venting the same thing over and over, I might say something like, "I love you. I this is sounds so hard. I've hit my max. I don't think I can listen to this anymore. You know, can I support you to find someone else?" I do this with my partner all the time.
Mm.
Know, it was so uncomfortable, Peter, to
Yeah.
say these things because I feel like, first of all, for me, the narrative I have around setting boundaries was I don't feel like I'm a loving person if I set
Mm.
I
Wow.
feel like I'm hurting them. And I would project a lot of the ways that I might feel hurt onto others, when in fact, most people were like, okay, cool. Not everyone, but a lot
Right.
of people were okay with them.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was an example of like if someone is coming to me for a lot or they want something that maybe they should be doing in therapy, like I can't process them. I'm a therapist. People come to me all the time for stuff and like navigating those emotional kind of conversations, it requires those boundaries often for me.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah. And I bet too, being a therapist, because I'm sure you have friends or family members that will, take advantage of what you do and be like, okay, so you're a therapist. And I'm sure people on social media too, often. I love your disclaimers on social media. I was like, oh, boundaries. Yes, I see them. No, those, yeah, I feel like, well, it's personal to you. I don't, not everyone might feel that way, but
Totally. I
yeah,
love how you made that distinction.
yeah,
Yeah.
I caught myself. I was like, wait, no, not everyone. But I resonated very, very much when you put those boundaries up for yourself, because I was like, wow, that's so like loving, for yourself. Like that's so like that's self-love right there. And yeah, because you have like what, 20,000 followers, and I'm sure everyone, as a therapist, everyone wants to ask you a lot of questions about life and situations. And so, um, respect for you putting up your boundaries and disclaimers around that. That's awesome.
Well, and you said something within that that made me think of another role of boundaries is that boundaries also provide clarity,
Mm,
right?
yes, that
Like
part.
I tell you what my limits are. I'm giving you a roadmap. I don't know if roadmap is the appropriate, like a map
Yeah,
to how to relate to me in a way without hurting me, without crossing the line. And again, that doesn't mean that new boundaries won't come up,
yeah.
but usually boundaries are created to protect vulnerable areas. So like
Mm,
if we think for me, like how I said, emotional boundaries are kind of like my big thing. It's not so much, I'm pretty good with physical touch as well, Peter. I grew up in a culture that like me and my mom, like there were always like limbs, there's some limbs that are crossed when we're sitting next to each other.
yeah,
I realize a lot of cultures maybe not
yeah.
open.
Mhm.
Um, my partner is sensitive with intellectual boundaries, and in the beginning, I was very much enduring those, and I'd have to make those repairs. He's like, Sylvia, I feel like you're invalidating my opinion about this. I have a different opinion. And I was like, no, we have to think about this the same way, or I'm right. I want to be right when I'm in that
Right.
mode. So
Wow.
that's a sensitive area for him.
Mhm.
So it's like taking that time to explore what are the areas. And again, those are the kind of four that I broke down, but there's material boundaries where like people are very particular about their belongings, their items, things that are sacred to them. They when they give something to someone, they want to make sure that it's returned. So there's different layers, and it definitely helps to just do that inventory to explore, how what are the things that maybe were injured for me and that I might need to bring a little bit more awareness and expression around when it comes to the boundaries conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, good stuff. Good stuff. No, thank you for the whole breakdown, because yeah, it's so so important. I feel, to discuss it and just break it down, because for me it's being very helpful. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Um, I I think I'm still trying to understand intellectual boundaries, because I know the emotional, like I can relate to emotional, I can relate to physical, I can even relate to spiritual, because I feel like even as a child, like those boundaries, like you're as a child, most of us are forced to just take on the religion of our parents, right? Of our culture. And then sometimes as we get older and we're like venturing out and discovering things for ourselves, like the culture and the family and the ancestors and whatever, like it may not match whatever you've learned or grew up with spiritually. And so for me, I find that happening for myself, because I'm like, no, I grew up Christian, but I don't just believe in the Christian values and beliefs anymore. I feel I've expanded my spirituality to believing in, you know, other things. So, but I'll find myself in discussions where people are like, well, are you Christian? And I'm like, I believe in God. And it's like a look or like a, a something. And I'm like, well, we're entitled to do our own spiritual discovery and exploration. And so the spiritual one, I don't think I've heard of that, but I love the way you put it, because it's a thing, really is.
It's a huge thing, Peter. It's one of the hardest to recover from when it's really when that pressure and that expectation to conform to a religion or spiritual belief is not aligned. I mean, you can imagine spirituality is such a who, I mean, it's such a deeply personal experience that we can't possibly compare. And the repercussions, right, of potentially leaving a religious group or a community, and what the cost is for something like that. I mean,
Yeah,
that's religious trauma exists for a reason.
it really does. It really does. And I identify as being a lesbian, so that too was tough growing up in a Christian, because I was just like, well, God doesn't love me because I'm gay, like because the Bible said so, and all these other things. So I had to explore that for myself, and then I was just like, F this. God loves everybody. Like, what is this bullshit? Anyways, that's me personally. So I stand strong on my spiritual boundaries because I feel like just growing up, I've had enough of being told what to do spiritually instead of just exploring it for myself. But
I really resonate with that, with the spiritual ones in particular as well. Yeah.
yeah,
Got it.
but I do want to go back to intellectual boundaries. So especially with you and your partner. So he identifies more with intellectual, and you identify more with emotional. What does intellectual look like? Exactly. Can you give an example of that? Like just him just not honoring how you're feeling emotionally and just trying to rationalize or analyze, like how.
You mean like when I'm injuring his intellectual boundary?
Yeah, or yeah, because he has intellectual boundaries and you have emotional boundaries. Yeah.
Well, let me frame this. So
Yeah.
the boundaries that I particularly have done a lot of work to express are around the emotional domain. My
Hmm.
partner, one of the areas that I have had to work to be much more sensitive of honoring his boundaries are oftentimes in the intellectual domain. So, for example, um, just being, sometimes if I'm in a mode of wanting to be right, or if I'm in a really activated state, I want my perspective to be the valid one, right? I'm like, no, this is the way that it happened.
Right.
And when you're in a relationship, one of the core things that is so important is learning to tolerate two different perspectives, because we
Mm-hmm.
become, when we're relating to someone, they have a different past, they have a different childhood, they have different opinions, they have different perceptions of the world. And when we're trying to make not make but when we're expecting the other person to see something in the same way, we're robbing them of their own perspective, of their own
Mm-hmm.
experience. So when I'm in those activated states, sometimes I can try to do that where like my version is the right version
Yeah.
and his gets minimized. And so he's had to really work at saying, when you do that, I feel like my opinions and my views don't matter. And
Mm-hmm.
he's 100% right that I do that. And so I have to be vigilant. And again, it doesn't mean that I do this perfectly. It still comes up for me from time to time, but I can acknowledge it, like, oh, I'm doing that thing. I'm so sorry. Can you share that with me again, because my brain was not listening, and I want to make sure that I'm hearing your side of things, your perspective, your opinions matter to me. So
Mm-hmm.
it's also, there's an element of, we can bring a lot of healing to our partners, our friends, people that we care about, in those areas that they have had to have strong vulnerabilities and boundaries. we
Yeah.
can we can be reassuring and show them that we want to protect those boundaries with them. We're
Yeah.
holding it with them. It's not just them
Yeah.
standing up for those boundaries. It's like, hey, you know what? I know that you have a boundary that after work, you need a little bit of alone time so that you can put your thoughts together before you come and connect with me. I'm going to run you a bath. I want to make sure that we're taking care of this.
Yeah.
I'm not an angel. Like, this is, again, I'm just giving examples of areas that I've grown and I've really learned to become a more supportive partner.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I don't have feelings about it, or sometimes feel like I can feel rejected or feel like I'm doing something wrong. But what are we working on? What are the things, what are the agreements that we want to put in place in our relationships, where we are prioritizing the wellness and the health of those we love, so that they feel safe with us? Because
Yeah.
that's what happens when we honor people's boundaries.
Yeah.
They feel safe with us, and there's the windows for showing up more authentically, more intimately, more vulnerably will open up more and more as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.